Welcome to the Mets Pod. On today's show, it's episode 31 for us. What better time to talk about the future of the lineup as we continue our offseason series? The Brandon Nimmo decision, who starts at catcher, free agent options, and much more. As always, we'll close out the show answering your mailbag questions. So a reminder to subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. And a major heads up from us. The Mets Pod will be part of the lineup this year at the Queens Baseball Convention presented by SNY. We'll be doing a live episode at the QBC on Saturday, December 3rd at the 4 Points by Sheridan in Flushing. We'll be one of several panels along with an autograph and Q&A session with special guests Bartolo Colon, R.A. Dickey, and Howard Johnson. Tickets are on sale now. For more information and to purchase tickets, visit queensbaseballconvention.com. Joe, I know you've been to the QBC. I've heard nothing but incredible things. I can't wait to be there, man, and I know you're excited to be back.
Yeah, the QBC is a fantastic event that Keith Blacknick puts together. I was on a couple of the State of the Mets panels, and I went once just as a fan to just watch everything happening. And yeah, they do a great job. They always bring in great guys, like they have Bartolo coming and Dickey and Hojo, and those are going to be other SNY people there. It's a day full of Mets stuff that's produced by a Mets fan. So couldn't recommend the QBC anymore. And if you do go, make sure you come up and say hi to Connor and I, because we'll definitely be there a little before our panel and maybe a little after. So make sure you come say hey.
Absolutely. We're excited to see everybody. If you're a fan of the show, if you're a Mets fan in general, bring your Mets fan friends. It's going to be an awesome time. So, Joe, we have a loaded show today. We got through the bullpen. We got through the starting rotation as well. So if you haven't checked those out yet, definitely revisit those after listening to this show. It's time to talk about the lineup. And as we've hinted at before, there might be a lot less turnover with this group than the bullpen and the starting pitcher by the nature of the lack of guys that are up for free agency. But there will be some interesting internal battles, decisions, trades are on the table. And with this Mets ownership, you can never underestimate them still making impact moves. But let's start with a guy that has known nothing but the New York Mets since he was drafted by them as a high schooler, in Brandon Nimmo. He is the big free agent decision they're going to have to make. Nimmo, who will be starting next year as a 30-year-old, improved massively in center field. We know what he brings to the top of the lineup. It's going to be very interesting to see what his next contract looks like, whether it is with the Mets or on a new team. But Joe, how do you break down the big Nimmo decision, whether it's you got to keep him around because there's no one else, and if you look at the center field market, there's not a lot, or do you think this is one of those scenarios where maybe there's more creativity than what it appears?
There certainly could be more creativity and there might have to be, because like you said, the free agent market is not robust in center field options. So if Brandon Nimmo prices himself out, I know there's some rumors that he could get upwards of $120 million. And is he worth $120 million? I think that's certainly a debate, but they're going to have a tough decision on their hands. He's a guy that is integral to how they want to build a lineup here. They build around on-base percentage. They build around defense. And Nimmo's been at the top of this lineup for years. So it's going to be very interesting to see how they want to address it. Are they willing to maybe pay a little more for Nimmo than he's quote-unquote worth, because the alternatives are risky? Or I guess you could think big, right? Like maybe it's not a pure center fielder. We talked about Jacob deGrom 2 weeks ago, how that money could potentially walk out the door. If Brandon Nimmo's money goes out the door, why aren't they pursuing Aaron Judge?
Sure.
I mean, they're in a situation where they have the money, they have the need for power and impact. It wouldn't hurt to throw that little jab to the other side of town to take their guy. And I'm sure there's a lot of people listening to this saying, Aaron Judge won't come to the Mets. Well, up until like 3 days before it happened, you and I were saying Max Scherzer isn't coming to the Mets. So money talks, and I'm interested to see how aggressive they're willing to be on Nimmo. And if he leaves, their alternate plan certainly is something worth wondering.
Without a doubt. I think there's a lot to unpack with Nimmo, right? The good is very obvious, and there's a lot of emotion in these decisions, not by the team. Proper front offices try to separate the emotion in free agent decisions, especially retaining your own free agents, because you never want to pay a guy for what he's done for you. You want to pay him for what he's going to do for you, especially on a contract where the term is expected to be 4 to 6 years. So now, the thing with Nimmo that you hear a lot is he is the type of personality that they want in their clubhouse and have valued in their clubhouse and want to retain in their clubhouse. That kind of thing really does matter. It seems like every time he speaks about it, he's loved being with the Mets organization. And not everybody feels that way. Everybody has different feelings. But Nimmo was drafted in a different Mets era, and it still has nothing but great things to say about the Mets. We know what his skill set is, Joe. Improved positioning and range in center field. He has excellent sprint speed. He's not a base stealer, but he's got excellent sprint speed. He's a guy that gets on base at a high mark. He could hit for a little pop here and there. And the biggest thing that the Mets always talk about, especially in an analytically driven environment, he works counts like no other at the top of the lineup. He is the catalyst for the Mets making starting pitchers throw 20-plus pitches in the first inning of every game, getting to the bullpen earlier than a lot of other teams. I think for me, Joe, the difficult things you have to weigh in this is that Nimmo played more than 100 games this year for only the second time in his career. He played 140 in 2018. He's somebody with a long injury list. We know about whether it's the neck. I'm just looking at his injury history on Fox Sports as well that has it all down. But it's been a lot of lower body injuries, hamstring, finger injury. Nimmo has missed a lot of time. And quietly, as much as he had a productive year, right, from an analytics standpoint, working counts and hitting for some pop last year, he did have his numbers decline. His on-base percentage went down from over 400 to 367. His batting average went down from 292 to 274. His OPS went down. It was 888 in 2020, 838 in 2021, and 800 in 2022. This is somebody that will start opening day as a 30-year-old with an injury history and not a wildly concerning decline by any stretch of the means, but something you have to factor in because you're not paying Brandon Nimmo just for 2023 or 2024. He's somebody that's going to be starting for you as a 34-year-old someday. So, Joe, hearing all those things, and I know you're aware of all of them, how difficult is it to weigh all of those? Because we love Brandon Nimmo, and we want Brandon Nimmo to be here, but those are huge red flags for a guy hitting free agency at 30 years old.
And another injury to add, which is not going to be on there. He tore his ACL in high school, so even before the Mets drafted him, so he's had that in his past as well. It's incredibly difficult because, like you said, you don't want to be paying for what he did in 2018, what he did in 2019, because you're going to be paying him in theory through 2026 or 2027, and I don't think they want to put Starling Marte in center. I know that's something that a lot of people have insinuated, that you let Nimmo go, you move Marte over to center, and then you sign a corner outfielder where that market is a little stronger. I do think that could be on the table, but the reality is I think the Mets want Starling Marte in the corner for health preservation because Starling Marte has had his share of things and he is getting into his mid-30s. So they need to preserve him for that contract. So if you're not keeping Brandon Nimmo, I think the Mets need to go in with the idea they need to find an actual center fielder. And you look at the free agent list. I mean, there's nothing to be excited about. Let's put it that way. I mean, Kevin Kiermaier he can't hit. He's just a defensive player. AJ Pollock got a little better as the year went on, but he's not an answer in center field. He plays more corner now as well. It kind of feels like it's Nimmo or the trade market. And what's out there in the trade market, that's really tough to kind of gauge at this point.
Yeah, it would have to be the trade market if Nimmo does walk. So it's difficult. There's a lot of good arguments to bring Nimmo back. And if they do, you and I on this show would totally understand it because you're not just evaluating Nimmo as a player, you're also evaluating the external market. And Nimmo is far and away the best option and could be the best option for a while. It's just something you have to evaluate in is what are our health concerns? What are our decline concerns into his mid-30s? And that's honestly the story with 90% of free agents out there. That's how this market goes. So Nimmo will be a fascinating situation to watch. I'll say this, Joe. I'll close out the book, even listing all those concerns. After Edwin Diaz, I think I'm the most confident about Brandon Nimmo being back out of all of the free agents, to be honest with you.
It feels like it would create so much work if they did not bring Nimmo back that I think I
Exactly.
kind of agree. Like, we're talking about the need for a center fielder. Okay, do you, this transitions into our next conversation throughout the rest of the lineup. Do you trade Mark Canha's money? Like, he's only 1 year, 13 million. Do you trade him to get bullpen help or starting pitching depth? And then maybe you sign Aaron Judge and you go, all right, well, we have Aaron Judge and Starling Marte in the corners. We can afford to have a defense only type of guy and Kevin Kiermaier in
That's a
center.
good point.
Like, if you don't bring back Nimmo, it's going to require like that level of creativity and roster manipulation because everybody's under contract. So it's not like you have too many chess pieces that you're able to move.
Yeah, it would have to take a creative trade that a lot of people wouldn't see coming, right? It's just one of those ones where you're like, we weren't aware, the general public or even a lot of the MLB media world wasn't aware that guy's available, at that price. And you try to think of those guys, it's even difficult really to think of that. You think of Brian Reynolds as a guy that's had trade rumors for a long time, but we know the price would be insane. And there's just, you try to think of creative names like that, but that's going to cost you a lot. So you're right, Joe. Not signing Nimmo can open the door for a lot of problems, and you really need a concrete plan B, C, and D if you have that fear that somebody's going to swoop in and pay him an astronomical amount that you're not willing to match. Another internal question, before we really dive deep into a ton of the external ones, but another internal question here. Catcher. And catcher is a little more black and white in a sense where it's not like the Mets starting catcher is a free agent and he's a really good player and you got to make a decision whether you're going to keep him or replace him. Right now, the Mets have a catcher that is drastically overpaid compared to what he produces in James McCann. They have a guy in Tomas Nido that is a really good number 2, right? You love having Tomas Nido as your backup. He's a Gold Glove caliber catcher as he's been nominated for a Gold Glove award. Not a guy that you expect to play, the bulk of the reps, but felt like he had to with McCann's injuries and lack of production. And then, the biggest wild card in this conversation, the best prospect of the Mets for who knows since when they had a prospect like this, Joe. You could answer that better. Francisco Alvarez is in this equation. The Mets have really concentrated on Alvarez improving his defense this season, and my assumption is they cared so much about that because they want Alvarez to actually be a catcher in 2023, not just DHing. So, Joe, a lot to unpack with the catching situation.
When I look at the catching situation, I just don't see any way that James McCann can be on the 2023 Mets. The reality is Francisco Alvarez does still need development defensively. But look, at some point in time, have to put the guy in the fire and have him learn on the job. That's really what's going to come down to. He could catch as many AAA guys as he wants. He'll have some fun catching like Bryce Montes de Oca sinkers and things like that, but he'll also be catching, the likes of Jared Eichhoff pitches that's not preparing you for big league pitching. The only way to do it is to do it. And to me, the Mets need to find their way out of James McCann. It's clear that contract was questioned at the time for good reason. He had such a limited track record of success. And now you're at the point that I think you have to find a taker for him. And if that means eating 50% of his money, 70% of his money, I think you kind of do what you have to do and you ship him out of town and you give Alvarez the ball. I truly believe opening day 2023, the right move is Francisco Alvarez as your starting catcher, Tomas Nido as the backup, and you kind of get what you can for James McCann.
I'm with you as well. I mean, man, if you save $2 to $3 million of James McCann's money, that's a positive. Maybe that's a Trevor May. Maybe that's a piece of Adam Ottavino coming back. That is money that matters for a player that, this is harsh, and I don't like saying this, but James McCann doesn't matter to the 2023 Mets right now. He's unless you're hoping for a miracle bounce back to mediocrity. I'm not saying to be an all-star. I'm not saying to be an above-average catcher. I'm not saying to be average. I'm saying mediocrity. You're hoping for that when, honestly, you don't need that. Tomas Nido deserves to play. Francisco Alvarez needs to play. He can be a superstar for this team. So I think that one is simple in that way, Joe. It's just a matter of finding how you're going to get McCann off the roster, and then you're going to war with two guys that, one, you have faith in to blossom into a star. The other guy that's been a model of consistency behind the plate in Nido, and maybe an underappreciated player.
Catching across the sport is so bad. It's like offensive line play in the NFL. Like, if you have a good catcher, it's gold. And the Mets right now don't have that situation with James McCann. So if you pay down enough, there's teams out there for $2 million a year, $3 million a year that would be willing to take that shot. And one thing that we'll talk about, I think, as we continue through today's show, is the need to add some thump in this lineup. And let me tell you, Francisco Alvarez is going to provide that thump. What will his consistent numbers be over a full rookie season? I can't tell you, but he's going to hit home runs. That I will tell you.
I mean, here's the difference, right? And maybe we don't talk about this enough when factoring in how can the Mets get better offensively and improve their most important metric, which is power, something like you said, Joe. Nido hit 3 home runs last year. And once again, we like Nido. We think he's an ideal number 2. Nido hit 3 home runs. McCann hit 3 home runs. The Mets got 6 home runs from the catcher position while getting, really, offensively speaking, not much else. If Alvarez, Joe, hit 23 home runs, you're talking about 17 more home runs from the position from one guy. And that's a low mark. Like, Alvarez can be a 30 home run guy eventually, but setting the bar low for him to hit 23 home runs, that alone is a massive, massive difference. Let's continue down the lineup. I think we can cross off the obvious. We know Francisco Lindor is playing shortstop. We know Pete Alonso is playing first base. Where there's a little bit more flexibility, Joe, seems to be third base and second base. And that's not saying Jeff McNeil's going anywhere. What the beauty of many things about Jeff McNeil, besides the fact that he's a batting title champ, is that he could adequately play a corner for you. He could play second base. You can get creative with how you use him. Second base could be a spot where they can add, not expecting to, but can add. Third base is an interesting place because you have Brett Beatty, who got a cup of coffee before unfortunately getting hurt. You do have Carlos Correa out there, who we know is very close with the Francisco Lindor. Then, of course, you had Escobar, who finished the year as the Mets' hottest hitter in August and September and even carried it into October a little bit. So there's a little bit more flexibility, it feels like, on the infield with those two spots than we often discuss.
For sure. And Jeff McNeil, like you said, I don't think he's going anywhere outside of the Mets organization, but he could be going to a different position on the diamond. I mean, who's to say the Mets don't pursue a Trea Turner? Because all this hinges back to is Jacob deGrom. If they pay Jacob deGrom $45 million a year, you're probably scratching off the premier offensive free agents like the Judges, the Trea Turners, the Correas. But if Jacob deGrom walks out that door, everything should be open. And that's a Trea Turner at second, Jeff McNeil to left field, Mark Canha maybe traded out the door. If you want to sign a Correa, maybe that means Eduardo Escobar becomes a utility guy, an expensive one, but a 1-year, $10 million utility man.
Hey, this team has no DH, by the way.
Yeah, they have no DH, which we'll get to, but maybe you sign a Correa and that opens up the door to include Brett Beatty in a trade for Shohei Ohtani. Like, there's so many things that can truly be on the table when you talk about those positions specifically. There are free agents and there's some flexibility where, depending on what they choose to do, that could lead to the trading of someone. Like I said, like a Beatty. Ohtani is a guy that we're going to talk about a lot this offseason. Until he's traded to the Mets somewhere else or taken off the market, Shohei Ohtani is going to be a consistent conversation on this show and probably any other baseball podcast you listen to.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's the big one, right? Because that is the classic fills two voids. He can be your frontline starter along with Max Scherzer, and he can be your DH. And then you're looking there, and he gets you all the power you needed. So, I mean, you're right, Joe. I think the elephant in the room, the trickle effect in all of this, is what happens with Jacob deGrom. And I'll be honest with you, and maybe this is the problem, the fan thought of like always being attracted to something new. The more we have the deGrom conversation and the fallout of it, I'm less enthusiastic about giving Jacob deGrom $45 million a year and then crossing off the ability to get so much better in multiple other areas. And because that comes with the prayer that you're not guaranteed to get Cy Young Jacob deGrom for a full season for the 3 or 4 years or whatever that contract is. You're sitting there praying that the guy stays healthy and pitches at a high caliber level that, honestly, the chances of him pitching to that number, and a lot of free agents don't play up to their number. That's the name of the game. It's free agency as a whole. It's why sustainable franchises don't like to rely on free agency. They like to use it as a supplement instead. But it just goes back to where bringing back deGrom, yeah, it could be a sigh of relief. It can also create a lot of problems for this team getting over the hump.
It's definitely, the more we talk about it and talk about these other options, it makes me feel like and it almost feels like we're bad Mets fans, right? That, I mean, Jacob deGrom's the homegrown guy. He's been kind of the franchise starter, won back-to-back Cy Youngs, is still on a Hall of Fame type of trajectory. But the reality is the Mets need to focus on building the best team that they can do for the 2023 season. And does that include Jacob deGrom? Maybe. There's different ways to do it, right? You don't there's not only one path to winning. Like, you don't necessarily have to win with just a bunch of frontline starting. You don't necessarily win with a bunch of offensive power. We've seen the Phillies obviously are a uniquely built team. The Astros are just so well-rounded. I think I am definitely leaning personally that I would let Jacob deGrom walk for that big money. So I don't want to be investing $90 million a year into two starters north of 35 years old with health concerns, which that comes with the territory of being in your mid to upper 30s and finding different ways to spend that money. Like, realistically, if you let Jacob deGrom walk for $45 million, you can get Carlos Correa and a good, maybe not great, but a good starting pitcher probably for that type of money. Maybe it might be slightly off, but maybe you're trading some of that McCann money, and then this all offsets itself. Like, realistically, I think Correa and Bassett for deGrom and some of McCann's money probably isn't as far off of a wash as you'd think.
Man, when you say it like that, it drives you nuts, because you're like, you love the idea of that, and then you also have the fear of letting, the greatest pitcher of this generation maybe walk out the door, but there's a lot of nuance in that. So the Correa Trea Turner situation feels like the, hiding in the weeds situation. Like, every Mets fan, justifiably so, is focused on, of course, getting Edwin Diaz back here for a long time, but Jacob deGrom, fixing the rest of the rotation, Brandon Nimmo, and then the conversation always shifts to where we'll go in a minute. I'll tease it right there, Aaron Judge. But you're right. Like, I think because we're so used to seeing that infield the way it is, and there's a lot of money already in that infield, you forget about the flexibility of, if you pay Trea Turner what he wants, maybe he's open to the idea of playing second base. I don't think Jeff McNeil really cares where he plays. Honestly, Jeff McNeil just wants to be out there. He plays at 100 miles an hour in left field, right field, second base, wherever the hell you need him. So I do think that Turner and Correa, while obviously not likely, and I would put the odds under maybe even 20% that one of them ends up a Met, they do change how the entire offseason looks and how it's expected to look.
Trea Turner played second base, don't forget, for the Dodgers when he got traded there initially, because Corey Seager was at shortstop. Yep. So he's clearly comfortable there. Correa has vastly improved as a shortstop, to the point where there was a lot of evaluators when he was in the minors, in the draft, and then obviously early on in his career, that he was going to be a third baseman before he turned 30. And he has stepped up his defense at short, that he has the ability to say, I'm a shortstop if he wants to. And, like you said, maybe the odds aren't high, but I think gone should be the days that we rule anything out. The money is there, the aggressiveness is there, the desire to win is there now with the New York Mets. So I'm taking nothing off the table. And if that means convincing Carlos Correa to play third base next to Francisco Lindor, or convincing Trea Turner to play second base next to Francisco Lindor, I think we certainly could have much bigger problems on our hands.
Great transition, Joe. Nothing is off the table. Let's talk about the big one, and that's Aaron Judge, a player that had a 10.6 WAR in 2022. You know it. We all know it. He hit 62 home runs, an OPS over 1,100, essentially all things unheard of. This is the craziest thing about Judge to me, just to speak to what kind of athlete he is. He stole 16 bases. This man is 6'7", listed 282. I have no idea. But he stole 16 bases. Judge is an incredible athlete. He's been healthy now for 2 full seasons. He played 148 games in 2021. He played 157 in 2022. He will be 31 years old at the end of April next year. I know it's so fascinating with Judge, right? We don't know if the Yankees are going to be able to keep him. We don't know the truth to the rumors of him going back home and San Francisco paying any amount of money. We've heard the Dodgers are going to snoop around Aaron Judge, which is an absolutely terrifying situation. If all those teams are in on Aaron Judge, I don't think the Mets are completely disconnecting the phone lines to at least check in on Aaron Judge. That we can safely assume with Aaron Judge means no Brandon Nimmo. I like how you led the show, Joe, by saying maybe it doesn't matter in that sense of center field if Judge and Marte are in your corner spots. For the sake of making this conversation a little tighter, we'll assume that Canna's money's moved. Maybe you get a reliever. Maybe you do it just to move some of the money and you get a lesser package back. But you're moving that kind of money because Marte and Judge are going to play a lot. And then you're starting a center fielder that doesn't give you any pop but is defensive first. Man, this lineup looks a lot different. And I know it comes off as a bit of a dream, comes off as even, once again, in the unlikely category, but you still, and trust me, the team front offices do this. They paint every picture. The thought of Francisco Lindor, Aaron Judge, and Pete Alonso all hitting in a 3-batter stretch is unbelievable, to be quite honest.
If Billy Epler and that front office are not having these type of conversations right now, they're not doing their job the way they should be. The reality is you should be exploring every opportunity. If that means moving Canna's money, if you want to go, if you circle back to third base, maybe Escobar's not the utility guy. Maybe you move Escobar's money. Like there's things you could do because so many of these contracts on the team, while these players are under control, it's a lot of short-term money, and short-term money is much more easily traded than long-term money, obviously. But I look at Aaron Judge and I don't think the Yankees could afford to let him walk. I think it kind of doesn't really matter what he wants. The Yankees almost have to do it.
I agree.
But if they don't, look, Aaron Judge fits exactly what this Mets team had kind of lacked. Big right-handed pop. Obviously, they have that with Alonso, but we had such an issue against left-handed pitching this year. And Aaron Judge would solve that. Aaron Judge hits for average. He gets on base. He could play center field if you want him to. He could play right field if you want him to. Like you said, he's a great athlete. And obviously the contract is going to be long. You're talking 8 years. You're talking maybe 9 years, depending, which takes him into a very old age, 39, 40 years old. And that's obviously a scary thought. But when I look at Aaron Judge, I say, if I could get 4 years of that contract of him playing the outfield, maybe 5. You mean, like, I look at Aaron Judge as a guy that will probably be able to hit a baseball until he's 45 years old if he wants to.
Yeah.
You just throw him in the DH. The DH spot exists now in the National League. So that could be kind of the long-term vision. But the short term, I mean, he probably won't replicate 2022 ever again.
Again.
Yeah, that's a top.
Okay.
That's a top 25 offensive season in baseball history or so, something like that. Like, incredible season, incredible guy that's proven he could handle New York. And, like I said before, I personally don't have that like Mets fan hate the Yankee attitude. I don't really care. They're in the other league. It's not my thing. But boy, the little jab in the side of taking their franchise player across town, like that would have to feel good.
It's something to dream about, right? Because the Judge conversation is, like you said, the long-term ramifications of it. That's just how it goes. And the reality is almost every free agent has those. Every free agent that gets a big contract or good money has those. There's not a lot of those, like Correa's deal last year where you're like, it's essentially a one-year deal. He's going to opt out. I think you look at it and go, if you want to win a World Series with this core and you're shopping for the premium beef, right? You're going for the prime cut here. I mean, it's something to think about. It really is, because the difference maker isn't even enough to describe him. It's the ultimate difference maker immediately, that you look at it and go, okay, this is going to be the biggest contract we're handing out in this short term that we've Steve Cohen has owned the team and is making all these huge free agency moves. But there's the side to it. If you believe in everything you've invested in player development and your scouting department that is drafted really well, and you think you're going to have a lot of cost-efficient players up with the team in the next 5 years or in 3 to 5 years, then it's not as crazy as it sounds, because this is one of those huge investments that you make, but you think you kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel where you don't always have to do this.
When you think back to when the Yankees signed CC Sabathia and Mark Teixeira and AJ Burnett back in that 2008 offseason.
With A-Rod on the payroll.
With A-Rod on the payroll. I remember when they signed Sabathia, I don't know if it was a public comment or like a source comment, but I remember reading this in an article. It's like, yeah, they signed CC for 7 years. If we get 4 great years on the front end and we're able to win a World Series, we'll deal with the back end of that contract when you get there. And I look at it very similarly, where with a Judge or even a Turner or Correa, any of these guys that we're talking about, it's a future Joe problem. Like this is a situation where, like you said, the Mets have this core in place that they have right now, and it's time to push for that World Series. And if that means in 2028, you have an old Aaron Judge or an older Carlos Correa or an older Trea Turner on your payroll for a lot of money, by then you should have a lot of prospects in the system that are, impacting the major league team based on where this organization is headed. I think the time to strike is now. And it goes back to that Jacob deGrom point. The more we talk about this offense and the ability to change it up, because it was a good offense this year. Let's not make a mistake about it. Obviously, didn't work out towards the end, and in the playoffs fell flat when they needed it the most. I think this offense just needs a shakeup in how it's put together. It doesn't need an overhaul. Like the rotation's going to be overhauled. The bullpen's going to be largely overhauled. The lineup just needs some tweaks and maybe some different looks at different spots. And I think the move is to take that Jacob deGrom money and push it to the offensive side of the ball and see which of these guys you could convince to come here. Because we said it last year. I said this. I'll say this again. Up until 2 days before they signed him, I would have told you Max Scherzer was not coming to the Mets. He wasn't coming to New York. The Mets are open for anything at this point, and they should be prepared to outbid the competition where they need to. And Steve Cohen has the finances that any contract shouldn't be crippling at any point during it at this point.
It's well said. I think we learned a lot last offseason, and this is when you and I were doing our mom and pop shop podcast. I'd call you and be like, dude, we got to record an emergency podcast. Like, I can't believe this is happening. And when you look at it, you learned that anything can happen. And maybe the Lindor trade was our first sign of that, but at the end of the day, that was still a trade. Lindor didn't really have full say. The free agents, especially veteran free agents that are established and have a plethora of options, that means something, especially when it's Max Scherzer that, like you said, you heard all of the rumblings of, you won't want to pitch in New York. The Mets organization is looked at in a certain way, a certain light, where I think people need to brace themselves that, this offseason can bring much of the same. Be prepared for the unexpected. Expect the unexpected. All right,
The,
everyone. Go ahead, Joe.
yeah. With the Max Scherzer, it's very reminiscent to me of obviously the financial commitment is at a different level, but it's very reminiscent of Pedro Martinez signing with the Mets. At that point, the Mets were coming off. They had already had their kind of World Series run in 2000. And for those next couple years, oh man, I mean, you remember those Mets teams, not quite so hot. And the perception of the organization was, the perception of the organization wasn't great. Pedro came in, and that made the Mets relevant again in the marketplace. And that led to Beltran being willing to come. And then they made the trades for Delgado, and they did other things. But it took that one person that everyone said wouldn't come to the Mets. Pedro wouldn't leave the Red Sox for the Mets, especially after they won a World Series, mind you, for the first time in 100 years or 86 years, whatever it was. Then Pedro signed with the Mets. Things changed. The same conversation was Max Scherzer last year. He's not going to come to the Mets. He's going to stay out west with the Dodgers, where they're going to win World Series, and they're going to be a top team. Well, Max Scherzer came to the Mets, and I think the tide is changing, and you're going to see more stuff come through the pike that we may call unexpected, but I don't think unexpected is really a thing anymore.
I completely agree. All right, reminder, everyone, you're listening to the Mets Pod, and a reminder to subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcast. Joe, I saved DH for the mailbag because we got a great question from Johnny, who asked, do you feel like a platoon or a platoon of Vientos and Vogelback at DH could be enough at that position?
I would say no. I think they should be looking to take an opportunity at the DH market. I think Daniel Vogelback at $1 million or $1.5 million, they should pick up that option. And I guess absolute worst case, he's lefty thump off the bench for $1 million. Granted, no versatility, but he'll have thump and you'll be able to play him at DH from time to time. The DH market actually has some intriguing, albeit older names, though that often comes with the territory of the DH type role. Jose Abreu is a guy that I've talked about. His power numbers were down this year. He only hit, I believe, 16 home runs. But if you look at all of his underlying metrics, exit velocity was still there. The barrel rate was still there. He was hitting the ball hard. He didn't hit home runs. So you have to do more than look at Baseball Savant's page and look at the red and blues, and that doesn't tell the whole story. But that kind of information at least leads me to believe that maybe Jose Abreu's power isn't gone. It just didn't happen this year for some reason that I don't know. But the Mets analytics team can look into that. JD Martinez, he had a back thing that you have to look into, but he's a free agent. So there's a couple interesting guys. Justin Turner, if you really want to go down that tree. Mike Puma at the Post talked to Justin Turner yesterday, and he said be open-minded to returning to the Mets. So that's a guy who's on the older side again, but could be a DH option. Trey Mancini, we wanted him at the trade deadline. Remember that? He didn't quite do so hot in the playoffs here for the Astros, but he's another guy. There's enough guys out there that I think the Mets can improve the designated hitter position using free agent dollars, and most importantly, short-term free agent dollars, because these are older players.
Yeah, that's an interesting market. It's always, like you said, a good you get at what is it I'm looking for? You're looking for that kind of, it's like a contract, like a bounty hunter kind of. You're looking for that mercenary, that 1 year. The Nats tried it last year and it didn't work out with Nelson Cruz, but that's kind of the example of, hey, we can get this guy for a year. We think he can give us 25 home runs. We don't really care what we pay him because it's only the term is only 1 year, that kind of situation. So it will be interesting to see if they do dive into that market. But I do agree with you that Vogelback, he'll return just because the money is couch cushion pennies for the Steve Cohen Mets. But that doesn't mean he's necessarily the answer. So All right. Um, Mikey Chips says all of the free agent moves made so far under this new regime were completely under the radar, which is great. Could you give us your under the radar move you would want the Mets to make to this lineup? I just kind of wanted to throw one out here that I found interesting, and I believe it was Tim Britton from The Athletic. They listed a lot of players, and it wasn't off of sources. It was more based off of contractual speculation. But Teoscar Hernandez from the Blue Jays was somebody listed. Could be a kind of this under the radar trade candidate because he can hit free agency after 2023. And now the Blue Jays are a team that obviously they're trying to win. And maybe they, with a guy like Hernandez, they go into the year, evaluate their first half of the season. If it doesn't go the way they want, he becomes one of the biggest deadline pieces. But you never know. I mean, this is a player, Joe, that has hit almost 60 home runs over the last 2 seasons, has a lot of pop. Do you have an underrated move or thoughts on something along those lines of, hey, trade for a guy that has 1 year left and has that kind of thump?
I really have to look at next year's free agent class, I think. And
It's always the trick.
we're gonna be here all winter, so we're gonna have plenty of time to talk about who those trade candidates are, and those will become much more clear as we push forward over the next 3-4 weeks. So from a trade standpoint, I have to look up the following year's free agent class and see who is someone that has some skill that might not be on the best team, or maybe it's a crowded position on their roster. But it just depends how flexible they want to be with how they manipulate this lineup. Like we think about Jeff McNeil and everything he can do. He could play left field. He could play second base. He could play third base if you want him to. Do the Mets consider a true second baseman, not so much a Trea Turner, but a guy like Colton Wong could become a free agent. There's a club option there that they may pick up, but he had a good year offensively, and he's a fantastic defensive second baseman. So it kind of depends how they want to go about their roster. And I think utilizing McNeil's versatility, I think, gives you kind of the best opportunity to find value and still have the batting champion in your lineup.
All right, here's a little either or question from Taylor, who asked, would you rather sign Nimmo and Trea Turner, or would you rather have Diaz and deGrom?
Oh man. Wow, that's tough. That's tougher than I thought it would be.
I thought so too.
Yeah. I think they can't let Diaz go, but then we're paying Jacob deGrom, who we kind of just said, like, we don't want to pay Jacob deGrom. Wow.
Let me flip it, Joe.
Yeah,
I'll flip it, Joe, because I agree. The hard part about questions
awesome.
like that is you don't know what, like, if you say Turner and Nimmo, then who the hell is pitching in any inning, like, for the entire team? So that's why it's hard to answer. I'll have some fun with this one. I'll say, would you rather sign Nimmo and deGrom or Turner and Diaz? And I know right away my answer.
Oh, yeah, it's Turner and Diaz. That makes it much easier.
I don't think it's easy I think a lot of people, though, just can't stomach losing Jacob deGrom, while you and I have moved past the point where we're like, Diaz and Trea Turner, let's go.
Yeah, I know that largely, like, I know I'm a different fan than a lot of people that listen to this show and follow me on Twitter and we talk on Twitter. I know I have a different mindset, but I don't know why, but I'm a little less, like, emotionally connected to all of these players. Maybe it's just I have that constant, like, front office mindset. I've had it since I was 12 years old, when I, like, would find excuses to get in-school suspension because the in-school suspension teacher would play Stratomatic with me. Like, when I was 13 years old, I was doing, like, mock lineups. You could tell how cool I probably was in school. But, like, I wanted to be a GM when I was 13 years old. I've always kind of had that mindset. So that's carried over. And I'm just like, I'm not as emotionally invested in these guys, where, like, I love Jacob deGrom. He's fantastic. He's been a great Met. I love Brandon Nimmo. Like, I talked to Nimmo when he was in Brooklyn, interviewed him back then in the dugout with the Cyclones. So
God, he was a kid back then,
literally. Yeah. And nicest kid too. Like, I asked for 5 minutes and he just sat and talked with me for like 25 minutes. Great guy. But I'm a little less emotionally invested in individual players, and I'm more emotionally invested in the Mets haven't won a World Series in my entire life. and I want to see a World Series. I want to go to a parade. I want to be the last team standing. And if that means losing a quote unquote fan favorite, that doesn't really bother me as long as the team's in a better position to succeed. I don't want to see Jacob deGrom be let go and then they don't reissue that money properly and the team is actually worse.
All right, this last one, it hinted at something we talked about earlier on the show. It's from Stephen Forte. He said, I know the power issue was exposed in the second half, but do you really think the offense needs that much work? With Alvarez and Beatty contributing in 2023 and many other rotation and bullpen spots to fill, how does a re-sign of Nimmo and a signing of an Abreu/Rizzo type for DH sound? Joe, I really just want to know if you agree with that you can rely on the two youngsters, or do you have to get the short thing instead?
I would say I don't think this offense needs an overhaul. I think it just needs to be switched up. So, I mean, if they keep Nimmo and they add at DH, and then you account for, like you said, maybe Alvarez is a 20 home run guy. That's obviously a stark difference from what they got from catching this year. Third base, Beatty's an option, but Eduardo Escobar turned it on over the last 2 months of the season. So I'm not exactly rushing him out the door and pushing for Beatty for opening day. I wouldn't mind if Beatty opened up in AAA Syracuse. If they don't use him to go get Shohei Ohtani, I'm fine with running Escobar back out there, putting Beatty at third. But there's no question they just need to find a balance between what the offense was this past year, which was work counts, put the ball in play, and just try to make things happen that way, with they need some more thump because the only true power threats in the lineup were Pete Alonso and Francisco Lindor. So they need more power. But I think at the same time, that doesn't mean they need to, we're talking all these creative things because you have to discuss those kind of things. But I don't think they need to necessarily get rid of a bunch of guys and bring in a bunch of new ones. They just need to shake things up a little bit.
Joe, we are getting dangerously close to MLB free agency starting and really all of this stuff as our offseason series concludes here. I say concludes. We did the rotation, the bullpen, the lineup now. This show is not going anywhere. A reminder to everybody that we will be with you every single week throughout the offseason. And another reminder, we will be at the QBC, the Queens Baseball Convention. So for more details, go to queensbaseballconvention.com for that. Joe, episode 31. How perfect is that? Some closing thoughts from you.
Really excited to get going into truly the hot stove season. I think these last 3 weeks, I hope we've given you all a lot to think about as far as where the Mets can go with the rotation that has a lot of holes in it, the bullpen that has a lot of holes in it, and the offense that doesn't, but needs a changeup. So it's going to be an interesting and fun offseason to go through. And like you said, we're going to be here every single week. So, make sure you're still listening in.
All right, everybody, a reminder to subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll catch you next week.